Hi there, everybody. Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about transportation as a public good provided by state and local governments. So this is originally being recorded for my 132 class, State and Local Government Finance. This is where we get to the applications portion, and this is kind of fun because we're talking about applications, things that state and local governments actually provide to people. And transportation is one of those goods and services that we actually interact with on a pretty regular basis. When you think about what the state provides, we're thinking about the state providing roads, public transportation, lots of really cool things actually that we all interact with. And so there are going to be slides associated with this coming from the Fisher book and other materials. And so we want to take a little bit of time just to dip our toe into transportation and get a little sense of how some of these public goods actually play out in the real world. So let's get started. All right, here we go. So transportation is a great example of a public good. It represents a huge amount of expenditure. If you just look at highways, interstate highways cost at least $10 million per mile in urban areas and $5 million in rural areas in terms of construction, engineering, and acquisition of land. It's a hugely expensive component, a big part of government expenditure. It's a unique combination of public and private provision, right? The roads are provided publicly, but our private consumption of cars and other goods and services contribute to that sort of general service output, right? Roads and highways are the largest category of transportation, but there's other types of transportation we'll talk about too. We'll talk a little bit about public transportation just to give a fully realized view of everything. And all of these are funded by state and local governments. So one of the big things we can think about in terms of transportation is congestion. In 2011, congestion caused 5.5 billion hours of travel delay, wasted 2.9 billion gallons of fuel, and produced 56 billion pounds of carbon dioxide emissions for a total cost of $1.2 billion. That's how much waiting in traffic cost us in 2011. It's probably worse now. It's worse now, and we expect those costs to continue to go up. Road capacity continues to lag behind demand, and there is a reason for that. Because roads are so expensive, it makes sense that we want them to be fully utilized, and so it does make sense that capacity will lag behind demand, but that's still going to come with other costs, right? And you can see that over here. This is data from the textbook looking at the average cost of congestion in terms of delays, fuel, and carbon dioxide production. When we think about transportation, the most common and popular form of transportation is going to be driving. And here we've got some commute data. And this is a little bit old. This comes from the U.S. Census Bureau's 2000 data. And in this case, we see about 87%, almost 88% of the population drives alone or carpools. About almost 5% use public transportation, and then there's a small proportion that motorcycles, bicycles, walks, or uses some other means to get to work. That has changed. If we look at the 2019 data, we can see here there's still a large portion of people who drive alone, but that number is going down. We're seeing a little bit of an uptick in public transportation and other methods. We definitely saw COVID-19 push us the other direction. Public transportation felt less safe, and so we saw an increase in consumption of private vehicles, and we're going to expect that to kind of play out for a while. But still, the number one way that people commute is by driving alone in a car or carpooling. Here we can look at the numbers over time, and we see that people driving alone, and this is different data, so it's going to be a little bit different number. Looking at workers aged 16 or over, a lot of people prefer to drive alone. A smaller number of people take some kind of public transportation, and that number hasn't moved a lot if you look at these years, if you look at this over time. And then here we have people who work from home, and now that number has been growing, and especially in response to COVID-19, we're going to expect 2020, 2021, 2022 to see much larger numbers there. In terms of financing transportation, a lot of money, public money, goes to highways, a little bit goes to transport, and then we have air, water, rail, and pipeline, and then just sort of general overhead support. And we can see that over time, highways have become less of a priority as public transit has become more of a priority. We also see air travel taking more money over time. So that's kind of interesting. In terms of where state government highway revenue comes from, it comes from federal funds mostly. There is some user-generated revenue. That's stuff like tolls over here and gas taxes over here, construction bonds, and other. Where state government disbursements go, half of it is capital outlay, building new things. Some of it goes to grants to local governments or sub-state governments, maintenance and services, enforcement and safety, bond retirement, interest, and administration. And bond retirement is just paying out old bonds. Compared to other countries, here you can see the U.S. has more trucks and autos per 1,000 people than Canada, France, Germany, Japan, or the UK. And we have, relative to other populations, we have a lot more roads per people, or paved roads, kilometers of paved roads per 1,000 people. The only one we compare to is Canada. When we think about Canada, they have a lot of rural people. Their country is a lot more spread out than ours, so it makes sense that they have more roads, but they do have fewer roads per square kilometer. And so you can see that the U.S. has a lot more people driving, and we tend to have lower gas prices too, if you look at this line that looks at gas prices. With the next thing we want to look at, it's public transportation. Public transportation is relevant for us for a couple of reasons. One thing is that we do see a lot of public provision, right? It's public transportation. So we see local governments providing buses, trains, those kinds of things. In terms of ways to get around rather than driving a personal car. There are natural monopoly effects, and that comes from the very, very high fixed costs. So if we're thinking about trains like a BART system, those are going to have high fixed costs associated with creation and development of the routes, and then really relatively low per use cost. And even with buses, the buses represent a capital investment relative to what we see in a personal car. And then the per use cost is pretty low, and it's not really dependent on the number of people in the bus. So we're going to see natural monopolies in play, and that's where the role for the government comes in. The other thing we're going to see is what are called mooring economies. So the natural monopoly effects are kind of an economies of scale issue. Mooring economies are something else. And what mooring economies are is this idea that transportation is more efficient the more you use it. So one of the high costs associated with transportation is the wait cost, the time it takes to get to public transportation and the wait for a bus or a train to arrive to take you where you want to go. Those costs are smaller the more public transportation is used. The more you demand public transportation, the more routes there are, the more entries and exit points there are, right? The faster they run. So that instead of having to wait a half hour, or instead of having to wait an hour, you only have to wait a half hour. Those access type costs mean that public transportation is better when more people use it. The more people use it, the faster it goes, the more stops they can make, the more different kinds of routes they can have, the more efficient it is for a user. And so both of those mean that there's an incentive to subsidize public transportation in order to get it to the place where we want it to be, in order to make it more efficient. And you can kind of get a sense of that here by looking at these average cost curves. So the average cost curves for the operator average cost curve is talking about the average cost of operation, the average cost associated with operating a bus system, for example. And it looks like a natural monopoly average cost curve in that it's always downward sloping. And so the cost of providing R1 ridership is much higher than the cost of providing R3 ridership. More riders means lower cost on average, the average cost of producing that transportation. The time average cost curve is talking about those mooring economies. The wait time associated with a bus schedule is much higher here at R1 than it is here at R3. So the more people riding the bus, the more routes are running, and the lower those wait costs, those time costs are. If we combine them and get this higher average cost curve, it shows that the time and the operator costs are still both downward sloping. And if we can increase ridership to that R3, that higher level of ridership, it's going to come at a much lower cost than if we had lower ridership. And that's the main incentive we have as a local government or as someone making these decisions as economists to subsidize public transportation. The last thing we want to talk about in terms of transportation, I told you this would be quick, is the idea of an optimal pricing for traffic. And this looks at private freeways and the idea that freeways have some point before which they are not congested, and some point after which where each additional car raises the cost of being on the road. And so I'm going to kind of recreate this graph for you. And so we have in XY space, we're looking at the quantity of traffic, or you can think of this as being the number of cars on the road, and costs up here. And with this graph, what we're thinking is there's a point at which cars or roads are uncongested, right? Up until a certain point. Think about driving on the road at 2 a.m. or 6 a.m. There aren't a lot of cars on the road, and so each additional car doesn't cause any cost to anyone else. And that's this part of the curve here. And that is true up until, my pen tried to run away from me, up until TC. TC represents the capacity of the freeway. It's how many cars the freeway can hold comfortably. Once you get past TC, each additional car raises the cost of being on the road in terms of the driving cost, right? In terms of the time cost associated with the commute. So if I'm on the road here, there's not a lot of cars, it's fine. My car doesn't bother anybody. If I'm on the road here, there is an upward sloping cost associated with being on the freeway because each additional car increases the cost on average of being on the road. That can also be considered the private cost faced by drivers. There's also the marginal cost. And the marginal cost can be thought of as being the negative externality effect associated with being on the road. And what this means is each additional driver is going to increase, after that capacity point, each additional driver is going to increase the average cost and the marginal cost of being on the freeway. I get on the road and my trip is slower. My average cost is slower, and I'm slowing down everybody else around me. And so that's how we get the sort of costs associated with being on the freeway. And then we can put in a demand curve. And we can imagine demand curve is based on how much people value being on the freeway at that time. When we do that, it gives us two things, two equilibria. The first is the marginal cost equilibria, and that's going to be the optimal level of traffic. And that's based on the externality damage created from congestion and the private cost associated with being on the road. The private or the market outcome is going to be this second higher level of traffic, TP. And what this tells us is once you get past that TC, that capacity of the freeway, each additional driver bears an additional cost and causes an additional cost to society. The market's going to tend to overproduce traffic relative to the socially optimal level. And that's where a congestion cost comes in, or a congestion toll. A congestion toll is basically a toll that raises the cost of being on the road, but takes into consideration how many cars are on the road and how busy the road is. And so it's not a toll like we think of tolls, like going across a bridge or going through a complicated or what was I thinking of? Turnpikes in the Midwest and that kind of thing. In this case, a toll is more like what we'd see in Singapore and other countries where you are charged based on how busy it is. So is it a congestion time? Is it a commute time? And how many cars are on the road? And that would be an optimal congestion tax. And the example here is in this video. I've got it posted on Canvas and you can watch it here. And this looks at congestion tolls in Singapore. The video is a little slow, but the idea here is that they charge people who drive in Singapore, and it's not just that you have to pay to drive on the road, it's that you pay and the cost is higher the higher the congestion. And this is just creating a market for that spot on the road so that only the people who value it the most take it. If the cost is too high and you're down here on the demand curve, then maybe you commute with a friend, or you take public transportation, or you decide to walk. But if you're up here and you really need to get there, maybe you have a doctor's appointment or you have to get to work, then you'll get on the freeway even though the costs are relatively high. So hopefully that makes sense. That is our brief overview of traffic. So a few parts of the chapter are left out, but we can think about transportation as being state and local goods produced for society, whether we're talking about bus routes, train routes, freeways, bridges. All of those are public goods and services provided by state and local governments. What I'll do is put together a participation activity for you. I'll have a little short separate video for you to take a look at that, and hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're going over. Let me know what questions you have. Let me know what you think about this. What do you think about Mohring economies? I think they're hilarious and awesome. They help really explain why a lot of suburban public transportation is really inefficient, because not many people use them. As long as people don't use public transportation in the US, it's going to be high cost. And then congestion, right? We see a lot of congestion. It would be nice to really know, do you need to be on the road right now? A congestion toll would work for that. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Have a great rest of the day.